Welcome, listeners and viewers, to our particular lecture tonight. I hope you have found a lot of interesting lectures from the Sacral Kingship of Christ, as well as from Dr. Tom Roberts' network and, of course, Father Tom Roberts. I'm Monsignor Roberts, and I think I have a very interesting lecture for you. I do not pretend to be the one and only authority in this particular area about America's demise and what is happening to us. There are many voices today. But I believe I have followed this both in academics, even though my degrees are in theology and divinity studies. Nevertheless, I think we can learn to take critical looks about where our culture, our country has been, and some very, very careful analysis needs to be done in regards to where we could be going. I remember being at the University of Washington reading the radical student papers in the 1970s. And Angela Davis and many other economic students were talking not just about Vietnam and the war machine that the United States had, but they were talking about the Federal Reserve System and how that needs to go. And I thought to myself, well, that sounds like some right wing papers I've read on secrets of the temple and so forth that came out later, but many precursors to it about the Federal Reserve on the far right said the same thing in American opinion. And I wondered, well, there must be a conversation that we haven't had yet in the national media. I began to read the same thing from Lyndon LaRouche. I was a member of the New Democratic Party at the time and felt that many things America could be doing to help herself were not in the national conversation. And I still believe that, fellow viewers, even more so today. Ralph Nader has stated that there are over 20 things that conservatives and liberals, or true patriots, could come together on and actually change the conversation in America. You're not going to do it until you destroy the corporate hold on the media and until we have national discourse that involves the people. I'm going to give you some of those 20 things that have been brought up that liberals and conservatives could agree on before the divide grew so big through the media and divisive politics, which of course favors the aristocracy in power. The more we fight with each other over false ideologies. Number one, let's realize that America has its aristocracy. And these aristocracies of over 50 families have been written about in 38 volumes. And it's where many of the Bushes, the leading families, the Clintons, may look like on the political stage that they are at odds with each other. But really, they come out of similar institutions. They're part of similar think tanks. And I don't mean to move this discussion clear into a conspiratorial type of model where everything that comes up gets explained as, well, the Illuminati did it. Look, that group has not been in any kind of power since the 1700s, yet we've got false reports because the term Illuminati was used through the Masons and used through the Rosicrucian training manual, that there's a secret group of 13 from Holland and Amsterdam who actually rule the world. That's a ridiculous notion, but there are indeed political factions of the rich and famous who we need to keep tabs on. Bohemian Grove is one that came out in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer in July of 1979 in a publication which I have in my library here in the archives that talk about who rules Washington and what are some of the key powers that are behind the story that you hear in the nightly news. It was very daring of the PI to print that way back when. And, folks, it's very interesting to really ask some key questions. What is the story behind the story? Is what we need to really look at. That's behind this oligarchy in the United States that keeps the downtrodden from really finding their place in corporate America. We don't seem to realize that we are creating a fascist environment in this country where only the rich can actually succeed in case a collapse of the economy, pray tell, ever does happen. Class warfare. The corporate media controls the discussions that we entertain. Sure, I can get on social media, but I'm no competition for Fox. In 1950, we had 70 different communications companies. Today, outside of NPR, Pacifica, and a few public outlets, we have basically 6. Time Warner, Fox, of course, and even at that level, they have different professionals on each other's boards. Walt Disney, Clear Channel, just to name a few. I came from a day in broadcasting where local ownership was encouraged. That was taken away from us, reports the Republican Sound Machine and the San Francisco Examiner, when 200 corporations were backed by the political parties on the cable news networks to actually, deliberately, to create a monopoly that would control much of the narrative spoken about in America today. Most American citizens are unaware of the fact that 200 corporations, writes the Examiner, were behind Sean Hannity and all of the major talk show hosts that would swing to the far right to prepare America to have a different conversation than had been held previously by the elitist media out of Washington. But at least we did not know the precise leanings of 30 minutes of news anchoring. America's news never was extremely journalistically at high standards, like Europe, like Japan, like many other nations who did a great deal of in depth reporting. When you'd listen to Radio Australia on shortwave, the ABC in Melbourne, or listen to Radio New Zealand, Radio France International, now France 24, and Deutsche Welle, the BBC internal and external services, we were trying to do a good job on CNN in its early years with Jill Dording and other wonderful news anchors when they'd go around the world in an hour and report on the international scene, because the American news media did not virtually talk much about that. Then, when Fox, of course, outbid everyone with the corporate backing that it had to undercut the other stations on cable, then they had to lower their standards because everything became profitable. And of course, the news media, of course, began to outdo the local network stations in ratings. And so, therefore, everything became politically and, of course, driven by its investors. So news became profitable. And if you were more conservative, you watched Fox. If you had more of a liberal vent or take on the news, of course, you might watch MSNBC. Never before in America had such propagandizing and merchandising of the news been permitted. But it's because you didn't have the same regulation on the cable channels. This began in 1984 when the 1934 FCC Act, where the people controlled the channels or frequencies that were allocated for AM, which were 107 frequencies between 540 and 1600 KC. And then you had later, when Armstrong invented the FM 88 to 108. And of course, they were to be owned by the public. The corporation attorneys came in 1994, wanted access to all of the American major markets, and the FCC and Congress acquiesced. What a shame. They sold us out. Local ownership was falling quickly because a third of the AM stations were broke. And of course, the mama networks had a way to fix that rather than encourage local ownership. So that's who's been controlling the conversation, and you can refer to the sources that I referred to earlier. Let's talk about a way to reverse engineer America's problems. Like John Kennedy said, these problems have been created by man. They can be solved by man. We can reverse and re-engineer our way out of these things, but that's not a part of today's conversation. Number one, let's start by getting rid of fiat currencies. Oh my goodness. They self-destruct over time. 7 nations in the world have gone back to putting oil and metal and precious commodities behind their currency. It's part of the reason we're in so much debt, because of the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 at Jekyll Island. One of the most interesting phenomena have happened. Yes, you can stimulate an economy and just float currencies, and that's part of the reason Nixon floated our currency back in the early 1970s to get rid of any vestige of gold or backing behind the dollar. So it would just be a credit note, so to speak, or a Federal Reserve note. And it's supposed to be based on GMP of the United States. But China's been clipping our tail for the last 40 years. We think we have a good quarter and we'll grow like 3.8% a year when they're at 8% or higher. Sure, Mr. Nixon, it was a good thing to recognize China. Things had to change. Did they have to change in the way that we have purposed it to end up? Okay, so fiat currency would have to go. Do you realize? Just like Rand Paul said many years ago, that we should audit the Fed because we had the right under the Federal Reserve Act to back out of that system if it failed to serve America with low interest rates and would add up debts. There was a lot of old money, like the Warburgs, as Pat Robertson accurately reports in his book, The Secret Kingdom. But one of the interesting things that I disagree with Pat Robertson is he's trying to create a right wing federalistic America that is based upon nothing but their dominion theology. And that's rising quite rapidly in the country. But his observation of the old world money taking over the freedoms America had, writes Lyndon LaRouche as well, when there was freedom in the early colonies. The Federalist Papers and other documents about the founding of America reveal that local economies were what the founders wanted, not free fall corporate economics like the right argues today, where God country gets involved with a fascist world leaning corporation, and where we have think tanks that have been sponsored by the corporations through ALEC and other supporters of this ganged approach for money, where even legislation has been written by corporations such as Procter and Gamble, such as the great seed market, that has controlled so much of the Monsanto debates over American farming and agriculture, was very much against the local controlled economy that the fathers sought to build. There for a while, each colony or state had their own church, had their own currency, if they so choose. And that many of them chose to do that. Okay. So we need to go back and recapture what the Federalist Papers said about what compromised the country would be a federal run church. It really didn't go into state churches that much. Georgia had one, Tennessee, and a few did. But for the most part, the Establishment Clause, and I recommend you read that book called The Establishment Clause, was just to protect the country from a state church like Europe had. Religion was not to be frowned upon, it was to be debated, even on the steps of the Supreme Court. Wow, we have fallen a long way. We need to return to which we never really had, but we did have a great control in times past over what you could spend to participate as a candidate in a public election. We need to completely publicize them and get the presidential election out of where may the best trillionaire winner take all in our system. It's wrong. It's dirty. In the late 1980s, when Bush number one was elected, it took $276 million in direct public programming, if you will, or outreach to the general public to push him over as president. By the time Donald Trump became president under some very auspicious circumstances, and of course that happened with Bush number two as well, they had been granted by the corporations over $7 trillion in free publicity. To this day, even though Donald Trump is no longer president, his picture is in the news every day. Free publicity from a very corrupt individual. And yet, there are patriots who believe that the left is so evil and the right is so good that no matter what the right does, no matter how corrupt they both are, with 92% of the same financiers financing both political parties so they can dance to the tune of the hickory stick, no matter who wins. We've got to take the profit out of elections, or we're just as corrupt as Brazil or any other fascist country. Go back to a classical model of education. Folks, we're gearing education today to be nothing but political dialogue brought into the classroom. We're not teaching people constitutional debates, civic duties, mathematics. Well, the gifted can do it. Literature, well, it's taught, but not like it should be. But boy, play the political game. And boy, that's where the bucks are. In 1968, critical thinking test scores began to fall in America. So educators simply lowered the standards so people could still get into Harvard, Yale, Ivy League schools and state schools, and local secondary schools with less and less critical thinking. With more and more courses being given in media. I'm not against that, but should you have a master's degree in corporate media? Well, they do exist. In the United States today, and I'm working on my third doctorate, my second PhD from a foreign university, because I believe in the old classical model. Now, we used to believe in the self made man in America, where you could be intelligent and learn a trade, and yet you still had a general idea of what America stood for. That's completely gone in our ethos today. All you get is right and left fighting with each other over the crumbs, and the American people get left behind. We need national debates on these subjects. If we returned to a classical form of education, we would know a lot more culture, a lot more about American and European and Asian history. We would be a lot more informed, a lot more analytical in our thought process. All education is considered to be, for most people today, is a way to earn a living, and if you can't do it, who needs it? How did we get here? I didn't receive my seminary and graduate educations to just make money, but to be a better Monsignor Tom Roberts, to be a better scholar, a better human being, a more enlightened thinker, more aware of social issues, how to critically examine my own biases, which is something we don't even believe we have today. We're that uneducated. All right, let's understand civil duties that America, from the earliest days of her inception, there was always to be a liberal and conservative divide between the Hamiltonians, followed Hamilton, and the Jeffersonians. In other words, diversity of thought is good. It's how do we bring the best of all ideas to the forefront? That's what the founders wanted, people. You weren't to be exercised out of the discussion because you were a Democrat or a Republican like we do today, because we think it's un-American. Well, let's debate it. I used to learn so much by participating in debate in junior high school. Today's politicians, they're not well informed. A few are better informed than others, but we don't make good orators anymore, like Al Smith, like John Kennedy, like President Roosevelt. People today can hardly string a sentence together, let alone understand critical theory about economics. Who was Adam Smith? What is supply side economics? It's talked about chapter 1 of any economics textbook who's worth a hoot. What did Keynesian economics actually represent? Not communistic government control, like the right wing says, but to create fairness in the marketplace so you did not have this kind of totalitarian corporate fascism today that's over America, where economic theory as practically practiced just means trickle down. Well, you know what trickles down a person's pant leg. I don't need to describe that. But nevertheless, when are we going to get tired of that stuff running down from this trickle down voodoo economics? And we keep thinking the corporations are going to fix it. That's what Ronald Reagan thought. And they took the money out of the country. Wow. When will we learn? So let's move on to the next subject here. We've got to limit our ability to go to war. That's a big one. Today we get around it, we just call them police actions. Defense, as the State Department calls it, for American interest. That propaganda goes right by the American people. In my professional opinion, we ought to defend nations who have similar values to the U.S. Corporate interest can mean Zapata oil, which the Bushes own in the Caribbean, and we've got to defend that. One African leader once said, if there's no oil or anything America wants, they won't defend us. Even though many, many millions of people in Mozambique and other countries have died. I would love to see an America who has peacekeeping forces to bring morality and judgment and self-determination of other nations. Self-determination by some of our minority peoples today. Self-determination, said Abernathy. And while I generally didn't support his radical views, I had to admit in the 1970s that he was correct when he made that statement, that the American aristocracy doesn't ask the minority people, and I mean that in the ethnic sense, about self-determination. Why? We are not going to fix America's unrest until everyone, or as many as possible, become a winner. What else do we need to consider to limit our wars? Look at what we have spent in Iran and Iraq over American interest. 11 trillion. And most Americans do not know that Paul Wolfowitz and others wanted 19 American bases. I've read the 96-page report. And we wanted an American presence to get American oil. That was the PNOC doctrine that the Bush administration subscribed to. And what's sad about that is we don't even know how America was stolen from her people by these international global bureaucrats. And yet the PNOC doctrine was online. You could go right to the website and read it. You can read CFR reports. I've read them back to 1977 when they were saying that America would eventually be dropped when China became great and there was no longer need for the US dollar to be the prevailing currency in the world. How blind do we have to be? A BYU professor has written a great book. Just Google it and try to find it. They Rule in Plain Sight. I'm not saying that I believe what the conspiracy people always try to advocate, like there's little green men ruling in Washington and everything's a false flag. Oh, don't believe that garbage for a minute. But do read critical books that do give you economic and historical information, that point out government documents as they become released and part of the public persona. Do read books that give you that kind of information. Not everything on social media is true at all. Most of it, unless you're reading journals and sources you're familiar with, is very corrupt. 1966, most Americans are unaware of the fact that during the OBJ administration, antitrust laws, they control corporate taxes, ownership, as well as, mortgages and lots of other corporate law and investments were rewritten where American companies would buy into Sony and others, and they could buy into Zenith and to create a great global market. Congress went along with this very naively. By 1972, most American plants were shut down. Most American electronics firms. Zenith tried to hang on, bless their hearts. They were such a great quality oriented company, but even they had to quit making picture tubes in the late 80s in Ohio. And all of a sudden, very quickly, American wages were under attack. We're now about 20th in the world, and yet we still think we're the greatest pocket spending people in the world. It's not true. Australia prices are 9%, 6 to 9% higher than the US, but their minimum wage starts at about 19 an hour. It's quite easy to make 25 in our sister country down under. And guess what, people? They pay out very little in welfare benefits. And their prices aren't much above the structure of the US or Canada. And yet, their healthcare system, the government works together with the insurance companies and small deductions to cover their entire system. Wow, imagine that. 1972, your friend and mine, Tricky Dick, Richard Nixon, allowed the insurance companies to have complete access to our medical co-ops. 1 year later, prices were up 49% in the state of Nevada. And the 8 medical companies that control America from her founding families who got the AMA going actually have allowed the raping of the American citizenry to not be able to afford to give good health care to many of our citizens. The county hospitals overnight just disappeared. Union plans, when we were 49% unionized, guess what? Had 100% coverage. Many of them did for their people. So our people felt it wasn't necessary to create a socialized product in the United States. And now we have record profits out of the oil companies, record profits out of the insurance companies, and of course, record profits out of our drug companies. And nobody can really say much about it. We got to do away with things like ALEC and pooling that actually control the monopolies in the United States. Where is it, Teddy Roosevelt? Yes, he was an expansionist with, American destiny and so forth, but he was against the corporations because he knew in the early 1900s that America would not exist as the Zion on the hill, or the great light on the hill, if indeed we did not return to constitutionalism. We've forgotten what the conversation was like with Reuben Clark and his wonderful exposés on the Constitution when Ezra Taft Benson was advising Congress and the Kennedy administration about constitutional matters. Today, we don't even know the difference between a historical interpretation of the Constitution or a progressive one. Is it supposed to grow with the people, with the democracy? What do we mean by that when the left says that? America is a republic who minors in democracy. Noam Chomsky, do well to get your definition straight. Now, I'm all for democracy in nations. I think sometimes America has, in our system, a winner take all that prevents collective coalitions from actually coming up with creative legislation in our Congress. I think the parliamentary system has some advantages, but some definite disadvantages to our system. But no form of government is, of course, perfect. Let us understand, and I agreed to talk about this earlier, the slippery slope of unbridled capitalism that Fox News, and they actually provide false narrative from Adam Smith and others that the American people don't understand about economics, and so they just believe that Adam Smith was for free fall modern day capitalism. Uh, and of course, with this propaganda, Americans, when Glass-Steagall was, of course, removed, don't even raise an eyebrow about this. Regulate Wall Street, we must do that. A flat tax may not be such a bad idea. We would have to study very carefully how much money the government needs to set a flat tax, but on the surface, it sounds good. Rand Paul and others used to talk about this, and other patriots. Just because people are on the right or the left, as Nader understands, doesn't mean that you're nothing but proletariat, as the Communist Manifesto, used to call the common person. America, Australia, Canada, Western Europe was to be a place where the farmer could be educated, where the farmer could have understanding of classical literature, where people on the line working in Detroit in the auto industry could take part in the local governments and get information to be a part of the 17,000 school districts with PTA meetings across America. But it's become such an elitist operation that most parents are talked to like they're a bunch of invalids. No, America was supposed to be a place where the common person could become great. And she still could be. Let us understand that crime and rehabilitation should exist to help us be a fine-tuned society. America spends more today on incarcerations than we do on education, because when the conservatives get in, they cut, but they don't fix anything. Then we're involved with foreign wars by Democrat and Republican administrations. And so the people are never served. We throw money away, tons of it in the Middle East that could have been used after 9/11 had we gone after the right enemy and rebuilt our infrastructure. And we've got to do away with the ALEC funded private corporation think tanks that are absolutely polluting our knowledge base. Then we blame the universities. Well, we're in worse shape now because of that. So we need to have crime and punishment that actually can give the people who deserve a second chance a way to rebuild their lives. And we need to treat drug addiction as, of course, a healing measure. Now, many of them have committed criminal crimes. That's the problem. By the time it gets to law enforcement, it's too late. Our social problems are cast in hard clay. And they are systemically part of who we are. I get so sick and tired of hearing people say, after gun violence, that's not who America is, or where in the hell is it occurring? With Santa Claus, it's occurring here by the thousands per year. And yet the gun lobby in America has grown more and more extreme. It's not the National Rifleman Association that it was when I was a boy. And that's what happens when everything becomes a part of the political machine. Get pork barrel spending out of bills. Write bills in the legislature that actually pertain to their cause. And stop throwing junk on top of it that Congress hasn't even read. In the state of Idaho, right next door to where I'm speaking to you from, we have such untrained legislature members and legislators that they can't even read in the small counties of Idaho the jargon that's contained in the bills they vote on. Did you hear that? That's especially true in Adams County and backwards counties in Mountain America and in the southern states, and Lord knows where else. And it allows the elites to take advantage of that stupidity because they vote their uncle in or people they know from the school board. We don't demand high standards of our politicians like we did in Al Smith's time and his debates with, of course, the Roosevelts. I could go on and on about that. America was never to be a place where secularization meant that we become anti-church and anti-God and anti-morality. Christopher Hitchens, please reconsider that point. The church used to be the bedrock of our education. The church was behind science, not always in a popular or proper way, back to Copernicus here. But nevertheless, the church was behind higher learning. Today, most believers are seen as being rather unsophisticated and unable to be a part of our current national debates. How shameful. Even though there are many Christian universities, Hillsdale and others, who are trying to teach their people about the Constitution, be careful and make sure you're not getting an American nationalist hidden agenda, but one that really promotes the depth of the making of America by Cleon Skousen that used to be read in California schools, but was many years later recalled. Read what we did to the American Indian. Read how we violated every agreement we ever signed from a federal government position. Read how we acquiesced Texas and what the Texas Mexican U.S. war was really about. I've been in Mexico and seen the documents on the other side of that, and they are heartbreaking. It doesn't mean we whitewash America's history to please the racial divide. We simply need to tell it the best way that we know it. And McGraw-Hill and other publishers need to stop doing the reductionistic, revisionist view of history and tell what we know about it. Don't take down statues that were against our racial divide. Explain them. The very best antidote you have, fellow Americans, against false teaching of any kind, right or left, is what? Knowledge. Hosea says it sets free the people. We've got a Christian church today who doesn't know anything. We've got a dumbed down American electorate or proletariat, if you want to use the old commie name, who doesn't know or care much about these issues, but you're going to care someday. I don't know or care how you feel about the 1840s in America's history. There were many mistakes. There were new religions being founded, many of them under the guise of Restoration theology, which began with Alexander Campbell. And yet a lot of good has been discovered in these churches that have been forgotten by the established traditional church. 1870, Ellen White said America would begin to look like Babylon. And she said that there would be extreme right and extreme left in the latter days of her existence before she completely becomes, as Ellen looked at it, a beast power in the book of Revelation. I don't believe that interpretation, but her observation was certainly correct and has come true on a sociological, political, economic level. Joseph Smith in 1840, founder of the LDS tradition, said it was wrong for one part of mankind to put into slavery another. Now, he also said that the Constitution, picking this up from George Washington, would be saved by a string. And that's part of the reason Reuben Clark, Cleon Skousen, and others, and Ezra Taft Benson in the LDS tradition have fought so hard to save the Constitution. Maybe the Freeman Institute, where we were to study it like Scripture, needs to be reenacted, or at least where we have study groups who would reclaim America's sovereignty. Did you know that 67% of Americans in a recent Gallup poll did not know what the 4th of July stood for? Couldn't tell you what it meant. Buying firecrackers, I suppose, one said. How are we going to save this great republic with that kind of citizen non-involvement? The other day I was at the senior center, who I love the people very dearly, but we were trying to talk about some of these issues over lunch, and they just said, well, can't do nothing about it anyway. If we go down, let's go down swinging instead of giving it to them. Did you know in the book They Rule from the Bench, you can actually learn that Supreme Court justices can be impeached? That should have happened when they gave corporations a voice like people. They should have been impeached, all the Supreme Court justices who voted for that, because they get their corporate voice, and then all we get to do is vote for the leftovers or against the leftovers that the political elite give us. And all they got to do is keep things so expensive that we, as common citizens of this great republic, cannot run. The founders were against free fall capitalism. They would not have agreed with NAFTA. I used to call it SHAFTA, the TPP, and giving American sovereignty to international courts. I understand we need to cooperate with other countries. We need to work together in this world economy, but not heads I win, tails you lose, or from the other paradigm. We've got to give away the wealth of Western nations like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe to spread the world with our wealth and make us poor and break our labor unions and break our labor laws that were so hard to win in the teens and the 1920s by the progressive left at the time. Today's progressive left has become just as corrupt as the right has. Same financiers, just like the Cold War. They finance both sides of it, so the great corporations of the world win. I brought that up over lunch the other day, and a sweet lady said, we need the corporations to give us all the jobs. Well, why don't we create co-op companies that also have owners who run the company? Why do we have to have corporations run everything for us? We used to have mid-sized corporations that would actually control much of the inner mountain and smaller American cities, and they were very healthy corporations who made bricks, they made mufflers for cars, they made tires, they were NC machinery types of places. They would support the big corporations, and the money stayed in those local economies. You weren't working to support Halliburton, who supported the death camps. So did General Motors. So did General Electric. Bell Helicopter in Vietnam got LBJ filthy rich so they could buy into 7-Eleven and other corporate holdings that were not illegal in and of themselves. Look at Zapata, what it did for the Bush family, and how they were instrumental in bringing the right-wing movements to America. Ask yourself, why, since the death of President Kennedy, have we had so many warmongers in the White House who find every reason to go to war rather than make America strong and to provide what we are capable of giving to our citizenry? It doesn't go that way. No, liberal and conservatives need to follow Lyndon LaRouche's advice. Reverse engineer what has gotten us into so much trouble. Yes, we talk about taking our country back. You can't do it through fascism and fanatical political organizations. You do it through legislation that comes from the people and rolls back the aristocracy. That's how you would do it. You can't do what we did in the 1960s. Peace, brother, peace, and hit the streets and destroy things, and then go back and refuse to study at your college. Remember, I started this lecture out by stating when I was at the University of Washington that there were commonalities that Angela Davis had with American Opinion magazine. And, Ralph Nader is certainly correct by pointing this out, that as long as we remain ungodly, although we need to be secular, that we don't have a church with dominionism that seeks to rule our country, as Pat Robertson, Bob Jones, and the Prayer Breakfast were started to implement those nationalistic ideals. I'm not saying that all these men and women mean to bring totalitarianism to the United States, but that would be the upshot. That would be the end result when it gets out of hand. Franz Josef Strauss once said about Hitler, we wanted him to be a buffer for communism, but the little SOB got out of hand, that little paper hanger. Yes, these things can happen. That's why we must come to the aid of our country. We must make America work for many, if not most, as close to all of her citizens as we can, or we will have continued violence and unrest. I promise you. We keep saying it's not the America I grew up in. It isn't. I grew up in an America who believed we could do anything, we could achieve anything, we could build anything. We had a moral conscience. It's been severed. And it's been severed by corporate America, where everything is about surveillance. There's a wonderful publication called Human Rights in the United States. And it's in many government and educational offices. And it says America is the most surveilled country on earth. And we talk about other nations. Why, the far right, if you have a labor policy, why, it's like you're talking about Starlog 13. Look, fascism is on the right and the left. Naomi Wolf did a superior book, and I disagree with some of the technical positions she takes, called The End of America. She gave it at the University of Washington, Kane Hall. I know that room very well. She said, I will shut up when America gets too close to fascism. Just before the Trump administration, she shut up. Other people have written right-wing reactions to The End of America. We need to understand America, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. We're wonderful countries. We've done a lot of good for the world. But our goods and services are not inexhaustible. If you take care of your own people first, then they're far more generous towards others. But to allow the onslaught against the American culture, and we do have one, as Anglo as it is, but it's supposed to be out of many one. We create an America, an Australia, a Dominion of Canada. We create that because the strength in our English-speaking nations are our people, are our moral center and faith in God, faith in something greater than ourselves. I'm scared when Hitchens convinces a modern generation under 30 that atheism is the way that America should travel. No, not down the phony road of American exceptionalism because we're us. America came up during the wonderful time of the Industrial Revolution, and we captured that dream with a moral and centric ethic that who made America was her people. And today, we just don't care about that conversation. Just give me food on the table, no matter how hard it is to make it in today's economy, and I'll shut up. Well, I'm not going to shut up. We need discussions about these things on the local level, the national level, not on just a few college campuses where I and others have given this kind of information. We need to listen to Noam Chomsky when he talks about the downfall of the capitalistic system. We need to understand what words like fascism means, that it's a combination of industry, government, and banking controlling the sociology of a country. Don't talk about communism if you don't know what the hell you're talking about. There were many more types of totalitarianism discussed in Russia by Lenin and Trotsky and others. And one thing is for sure, communism has been a colossal failure. But just because you represent labor unions and have some left leanings like Bernie Sanders doesn't mean you are a communist any more than not all right wing people are Nazis. But we do have draconian measures that are taken place as the right stands up against the left over abortion. I'm not for abortion, with the exception to protect the mother, but I am interested in protecting the women of this great country. I'm sorry that not all extreme right wingers feel that way about the women of their country, let alone the babies that Newt Gingrich says just throw them in an orphanage. Oh, that really worked well in American history. My final plea is this. America is a wonderful country, but we're not what we were. We're not the America that I remember who could do anything as a boy. We're not the America with an ethical center. We're very confused, marginalized people today. We don't know how to reverse engineer these issues that were started by man, as JFK said, and they were solved by man, or could be. Since the death of our president on November 22nd, 1963, America has lost her love for truth and her soul. Every time we have 5,000 more murders in this great land that seem to happen every week, we're losing our soul. Every time the political machine lies to us and we don't think for ourselves, America's soul deteriorates. Let's not be a part of its deterioration and sell out to the corporate globalist model, either it be right or left. But let's be faithful, informed Americans who will stand up and not be the last generation, but leave a better country for our sons and daughters, is my prayer in the name of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ. No matter what faith tradition, if any, you represent, let's get on the side of righteousness and leave a better world for our sons and daughters. Amen.